Wattle looks really good when there's no blood upon it. However, it is my melancholy duty to accept the fact that Australia wants war with China. Yesterday, it was announced that Morrison and Dutton and Payne have concluded, not commenced, have concluded secret negotiations with the United States of America and the Great British Islands for Australia to acquire a fleet of 8 Nukeyoulater powered submarines. This means cancelling a $90 billion deal which Australia had already signed with France for the supply of a fleet of 12 diesel-electric submarines, which were being retrofitted with diesels because the French submarines were designed, and originally their production line was producing machines that were nuclear powered. At the time, defence commentators who profess to know what they're on about suggested Australia was being a penny wise and a pound foolish in taking something that worked and deciding that for our personal particular requirements, a whole lot of big expensive redesign type changes had to be made. They basically said, if you want to buy that French submarine, accept the fact that it's going to be nuclear powered. And here in Australia, we don't like nuclear power. Our government's been attempting to build a nuclear power reactor since the 1960s. There's a concrete pad on the ground at Jervis Bay where they were going to put it because that's Commonwealth territory. We have one nuclear reactor in Australia. It's at Lucas Heights. There was one previous to that. It was also at Lucas Heights, the HIFAR reactor. I've actually been inside the containment dome for the HIFAR reactor in 1977 on a maths excursion. It was the IBM mainframe computer at Lucas Heights which convinced me to stay away from computers because it had turned a whole organisation full of certifiably clever boffins functionally stupid. In 1977, they told me that their plan for dealing with used fuel rods was to put them in a trench, concrete lined trench in the ground, full of water, and change the water with an electric fuel pump. Water come out of the Georges River, the electricity came from the Liddell power station. So they expected somebody to sit on a bulldozer and feed coal to the power station for 10,000 years to make the electricity to run the motor to run the water pump to cool their fuel rods. Muggins here said to him, look, if your fuel rod is a long vertical cylinder of depleted uranium and you're worried about it getting hot and you want to put it in a tub of water, why don't you put a tube around the outside of it? Connect the bottom end of the tube to a cold water manifold, connect the top end of the tube to a collecting manifold. The waste heat from the uranium is going to boil the water in the tube, and hot water is not as dense as cold water, so the hot water is going to float to the top of the tube, and that's going to suck fresh cold water in, and you'll have a thermosiphon powered nuclear fuel rod cooling system, which will be fail safe. And they said to me, back in the way back when, oh, the grid's perfectly reliable, don't you worry about that. Paraphrasing Joe Bjelke-Petersen, wanted to be the dictator of Queensland. And I shook my head and I decided that the computer at Lucas Heights had sent all these boffins stupid, otherwise they would have a fail-safe thermosiphon cooling system for their used fuel rods. But that was the one nuclear reactor we had in Australia. A research reactor, it's been replaced by another research reactor that spends most of its time making medical isotopes for use treating and diagnosing all kinds of weird ailments. Several governments have tried to fly a kite, sniff around the idea of establishing a nuclear power industry in Australia, a electricity generating fission reactor. The population just doesn't want it, you know. Vast numbers of Australian troops cycled through Japan in 1945, 46, 48, 50, 53, either occupying Japan or fighting with the Chinese and the North Koreans on the Korean Peninsula. Lots and lots and lots of stories have been told in Australian households about the horrors of nuclear war. The Australian population just wasn't interested. The British said that nuclear power was safe, and then Sellafield went crackers. The Americans said nuclear power was safe, and 3 Mile Island brewed up and caught fire in the wiring runs, where some halfwit was using a candle to look for leaks in the wiring runs of a nuclear power station, and he set the control wires on fire. Clever, clever. Chernobyl, that was safe until they decided that they were going to run a test to see how long they could continue to generate power after the cooling system was shut down, and they managed to set their bloody reactor on fire. Sellafield was a graphite modified reactor. That means they built the core of their nuclear reactor out of pure carbon. A carbon matrix with air holes, and it was air cooled. So guess what happened when it caught fire? The fucking coal caught alight, because, you know, carbon, graphite, coal, pretty good analogy, chemically correct. Yeah, and then there was the Japanese at Fukushima Daiichi. Well, they did exactly what I warned the Lucas Heights boffins about. They had grid-powered electricity running the water pumps to keep their used fuel rods cool, only they had them in swimming pools on top of the roof of their nuclear power plant. They had an earthquake which gave them a tidal wave. The earthquake knocked the power grid down. They went to their backup generators, and the tidal wave flooded their backup generators, so their used fuel rods went dry and boiled and burned. Meanwhile, 3 reactors melted down because they couldn't cool them either. Therefore, thus and because, when the Australian Greens Party calls the idea of Australia buying a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, a plan to install floating Chernobyls in the seaports of Australia that are going to cater to them, which presumably will be Sydney and Perth and Adelaide, because they're going to be built in Adelaide. They're going to get here sometime around 2040, we think, the Australian-built fleet of 8. And here we come to the nub of the proposal, which is that in the meantime, in order to bring the Australian Navy up to speed in terms of, you know, having 2 commanding officers and I think 8 engineering officers on board each submarine instead of 1 commanding officer and 1 engineering officer, Australian naval personnel are going to be serving on American nuclear-powered submarines and on British nuclear-powered submarines, and British and American operational units will be operating in waters that Australia expects to operate within. And our Minister of Defence, Peter Dutton, who previously used to be the Minister in charge of ASIO, Minister for sort of anti-terrorist paranoia. And before he got into politics, he was a member of the Queensland Police at a time when the Queensland Police was responsible for the highest per capita deaths in custody rates of any police force in the British Commonwealth of Nations. He got to be Minister for Defence. Previously, I think Maurice Payne was the Assistant Minister for Defence, but now she's Minister for Foreign Affairs. She was the power-dressing, short-haired, butch bitch-looking, undiplomatic half-wit who I think it would have been maybe March last year, at the very earliest stages of Trump deciding to call COVID-19 the China virus. And when claims were first being made that China was using the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus as a weapon against the West by releasing it on an unsuspecting Western Hemisphere, Europe and America. More ice pain, MAURISEPAYNE, more eyes pain. The butch bitch looking Minister for Defence, Minister for Foreign Affairs, she decided to jump up and down and demand an independent committee of inquiry, something along the levels of the weapons inspectors headed by the Australian Hans Blix, who went into Iraq 20 years ago and said there is no weapons of mass destruction there. The weapons of mass destruction for which the excited status of Norte AmeriKano with Australia out front like a pet attack train chihuahua, yapping, went in there and tried to occupy Iraq so that we could go looking for the non-existent weapons of mass destruction that Hans Blix said was not there. Because after the 30 years ago liberation of Kuwait, George H.W. Bush, Iraq live fire exercise, Saddam Hussein decided not to have any weapons of mass destruction. He hadn't been game to use any of them when he had them, and he figured that all they were doing was providing an excuse for bully boys all around the world who'd actually sold him the bloody things to come and kick his ass for daring to look like a potential victim, I guess. But anyway, you know, back in the day, the Labor Prime Minister of Australia, Robert E. Lee Hawke, wanted to get some wartime prime ministerial hours into his logbook, so to speak. So he assured the world that Australia would support America's liberation of Kuwait before we were asked, in sort of the same way that Robert Gordon Menzies had the Australian Army Advisory Corps in Vietnam before the American Special Forces were over there trying to teach the Army of the Republic of Vietnam how to fight the insurgents, the Viet Cong. We had troops in Saigon in, I think it was 1960 or 61. There's a theory that says that our Prime Minister deeply wanted to entice America into a land war in Asia so that they could have a taste of being on an imperial power losing a colonial war. This is supposed to have emanated from Menzies' anger at America having stopped the 1956 Anglo-French-Israeli Suez invasion, which formed the death knell of the British Empire and the last gasp of the French Empire. And Menzies was upset with that. This is Menzies, who was our wartime Prime Minister, who was forced to step down when he lost a confidence vote when he returned from annoying Churchill, where he'd been hanging around the halls of power in Whitehall during 1941, attempting to direct the course of the war in Europe while Japan was building bombs and battleships out of the pig iron, which Menzies had insisted on exporting to Japan because their steel mills needed to be fed raw iron. Therefore, Menzies was known as Pig Iron Bob to the day he died. So the point I'm attempting to establish here is that Australia has a long and glorious tradition. Probably, I think it goes back to the Korean War. We had fighter squadrons in Japan that immediately began fighting on the side of the Americans and South Koreans against the North Koreans in 1950. And we raised a force of volunteers. They called themselves K-Force. 13,000 of them went to Korea. during the 3 years. I had 2 uncles went there, both dead now. But any time Australia intuits that Washington wants to have a war with another country, Australia runs out there and offers to land the first punch, bark the first bark, bite the first bite. Korea, Vietnam, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Iraq. And now after 20 years of attempting to occupy the graveyard of empires, America and Australia finally evacuated from Kabul under the armed guard of the Taliban, who were the United Nations recognised government of Afghanistan when America fought its way in there in 2001, 20 years ago. Not even a bloody month after getting their asses kicked, handed to them on a bleeding plate and thrown out of Afghanistan, now they've decided, oh, well, shit, you know, we couldn't defeat 15 million Afghans over 20 years. Let's have a go at 1.8 billion Chinamen, will we? Morris Payne's got them hating Australia by demanding an independent committee of inquiry into how the Chinese middle management bureaucrats fucked up their response to a pandemic and didn't dare tell Peking that they had intensive cares bed blocked and respiratory physicians dying of an unknown pneumonia virus. They didn't dare tell them that. And therefore the Chinese businessmen who had bought the entire Italian textile industry, they took the bat eaters lament virus from Wuhan to Europe, which is why Italy and Spain copped such a pizzling in the first wave. They'd been infected the longest. And then, of course, off to the skiing in the Alps, in Austria. Give it to all the other rich buggers flying all over Europe and the Northern Hemisphere and America. COVID was out because of the entrepreneurs and the yuppies and the dinks, the double income, no kids brigade. It got out of China because nobody from the Wuhan Committee of Public Health dared to tell anybody in Peking, look, listen, we've got this fucking out of control virus, so you're really going to have to, you know, like shut down Christmas, stop the New Year's Eve celebration, stop the Chinese New Year celebration, otherwise the virus is going to go all over the country and kill heaps and heaps of people. Yeah, well, by January, Peking agreed. By the start of February, they were welding people into their apartment blocks to enforce the lockdowns. The Chinese government in Peking, once they got their head around what was happening, they didn't take any half measures. They didn't have any late lockdowns softly administered with heaps of bloody exemptions, because quarantine with exemption is not quarantine, it's quarantine failure. So why the Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Maurice Payne, would want to irritate and antagonise the Chinese, who are notoriously, you know, like, I'm only 60 years old, but I'm pretty well aware that for hundreds of years, European civilization has been fully cognizant of the importance that the Chinese culture places on face, on the presentation of being honourable and competent and rich and noble and all those other things. Anything which involves a loss of face, publicly being seen to be less than perfectly competent, it's a complete anathema to their mindset. And they'd rather fucking kill you over an insult than shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, I fucked up. She picked a moment in time to do that when Australia had spent like 20 years as America's pet attack train Chihuahua, flying freedom of navigation exercises over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. You know why it's called the South China Sea? Because it's the ocean off the southern edge of China. Why the bloody hell would anybody expect China not to have an air interception defence zone that stretches well out past their visible horizon, just like the Americans do off both of their coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific coast? I mean, if the Chinese and the, I don't know, North Korean Navy decided they wanted to go over to Baja, California and steam up and down 12 miles off the coast launching fucking aircraft and landing them on. Do you not think that the American Defense Department would go a little bit apeshit? Would see that as threatening? I heard a retired Rear Admiral Barry today, an Australian naval gent, opining that he didn't know why China had recently been building the equivalent of an entire British Royal Navy per year worth of boats, which apparently, in his view, attempting to achieve parity with the United States Navy, which was a big enough navy to project force all around the world and to protect its friends against any possible enemy. And he had no problem with America having a navy that big because that's the stated goal of the American Navy, whereas he said China has never made any such stated intention, so I don't understand why they want to have any naval force on that scale. Well, considering that Australia's just joined an outfit called the Quad, which is Australia, America, India and Japan, for the purposes of mutual defence paranoid delusions of exercise, or exercises in delusion. It sort of puts me in mind of the days when NATO, the United States, the Western powers used to visualise themselves as lined up against the Warsaw Pact in Europe, and they saw it as a linear context, whereas the Soviet Union looked at the world through a northern polar view, and they saw the Soviet Union with United States military and missile bases all the way around it, from Alaska to Britain, all over Europe, Norway, Turkey, the Philippines. The Soviets saw themselves as being surrounded. Therefore, they tried to build a military which could deal with an attack on all fronts. The Chinese are a bit like that. Chinese and Indians, a bit like Indians and Pakistanis, but Chinese and Indians in particular recently have been going at it with pickaxes and wooden clubs on top of mountains and killing each other by throwing each other over cliffs in border disputes. The Chinese have had the experience of having what they thought was a pretty good empire. They built a bloody great big ocean-going fleet. They explored as far as the Arabian Gulf and saw what was going on there. They got as far as Australia. They went back, left the wooden fleet in port for 40 or 60 years and then burnt it because it was full of woodworm. They decided to use the ocean on one side, the Great Wall on the other side, and keep the barbarians out. Yeah, well, the Europeans went over there and used Chinese gunpowder in European manufactured weaponry to enforce a series of treaty ports. And Europe was gutting China, just like it gutted Africa and gutted India. Here in Australia, we sent troops to the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion to help the British Empire subjugate the Chinese. The Chinese culture has not forgotten that. The Australian culture pretty much has, except for the military historical nerds who celebrate every battle that every one of their ancestors was ever a part of. So the Chinese thought they were getting involved, this is like 30 years ago, they thought they were getting involved in a trading relationship with Australia, not recognising that they were supposed to continue to kowtow to we, the poor white trash of Asia, which is how, I think it was Lee Kuan Yew, Prime Minister of Singapore, described us back when Paul Keating was our Prime Minister. Australia, the poor white trash of Asia. So yeah, having been defeated by Afghanistan, Australia and America and England have now decided to go and show what fucking great powers we really are by having a shit fight with China. And in Australia, because it's going to take 18 years to build these bloody 8 Nukeyoulater powered submarines, we are opening our arms to British and American nuclear submarines, American bombers, American troops, American maintenance bases, and American missiles to be stationed on Australian soil. So welcome to the 51st state of the excited status of Norte armed AmeriKano. I don't believe England and America and Australia will be any better at containing China than they were at occupying Afghanistan. I just don't. I don't believe they're going to get too far towards having too much of a shit fight either, because global warming isn't going to stop for the very organisations that created it. I draw your attention to a previous video in which I mentioned that the largest single greenhouse gas emitting organisation on the planet is the United States of America's Department of Defence, because no other single organisation simultaneously operates as large a fleet of jets and as large a fleet of ocean-going ships on the scale that they do. You know, as many big ships, as many big heavy aeroplanes, as many giant gas guzzling land vehicles as they do. The US Department of Defense is the biggest global warming scumbag on the planet, and they now want to prepare to arm Australia to help them to fight China, because they are reluctant to see their hegemony in the Pacific diminished in any way. Meanwhile, 60-something% of Australian trade is with China. All of this crap about, oh, we have to go in there and maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea because 60% of our trade goes through the South China Sea. The only reason 60% of Australia's trade goes through the South China Sea is because we're shipping iron ore and coal to China. And China ships manufactured stuff back to us. I've got 2 rinky-dink water pumps, 6.5 horsepower. Start first, pull out of the box, never give me any trouble at all. One of them's got 50 hours on it, got me through the drought, got me through the mega firestorm season. They were made in China. Fan brand. Cost me $500 each. If I had bought the Briggs & Stratton water pump, assembled in America out of Chinese manufactured parts, it would have cost me $1,200. Yeah, more than twice the price. For each pump, each Briggs & Stratton was twice the price of a Chinese one. I got 2 Chinese pumps and still had change. And with the change, I bought a clapped out Japanese Honda. I've got an electric push bike made in China. I've got a trailer for the electric push bike too, also made in China. I've got a lot of electronic meters and instruments and tools made in China. Chinese stuff is pretty good. Anybody who thinks that made in China is a universal term of derision, they're living 30 years ago. On the whole of the electric push bike, the only trace of what you'd call Chinglish, where somebody who writes a manual in Chinese then has it translated to English and then somebody else puts it into production, is on the key which retains the battery on the electric bike. The key doesn't say retention, it says re-ention. If that's the only mistake on the whole bike, I'm going to be very pleased with it. But the idea that Australia is shaping up for a fight with China, on the one hand, yahoo, yippee. As it were foretold within the prophecy, the whole time I've been on YouTube, I have been declaring my personal forebodings at the idea that one of these days Australia is going to make the same dumbass decision that Hungary made in 1941. Australia is going to help America lose a war with China in the same way that Hungary helped Germany lose a war with the United Soviet Socialist Republics. And whereas Hungary got to be a Soviet satellite state for 35 years after that, how long will Australia be a Chinese farming and mining colony after we help America lose a war with China? England, well, they're on the other side of the bloody world. They don't share a shoreline with a body of water that is, keep going across that horizon, you will get to China. No. They're the other side of the world. I can't see England suffering too much in a war with China. I can't see him getting involved too much in a war with China. How useful was England in defending Singapore against the Japanese? They weren't real flash, were they? Yeah, you can expect that level of involvement. The Americans, they came out here and they used Australia as a fucking solid geological aircraft carrier, a place to locate rear area maintenance bases. Whereas Australia, we had both the Menzies government and the Curtin government, they were fully determined to defend 1/10 of Australia. That little sliver on the eastern side of a line that runs from Brisbane to Melbourne here, I'm on the western side of that line. This is part of Australia that was planned to be abandoned to the Japanese. The anti-Japanese tank traps are on the old Grafton Road, and they're about 30 kilometres east of here. I saw them in the 1960s before they burnt in the fires. But yeah, most manufactured goods on the shelves in Australian shops are made in China. The reason Australia's economy is still floating and strong is because China buys so much iron ore and so much metallurgical coal from us. They don't buy thermal coal for making electricity from us anymore, for the same sort of reason that they don't buy wine or barley or wheat or lobsters or wood or paper or any of the other things they've stopped buying from Australia because they can get them somewhere else, and they regard Australia as the supercilious, racist, white supremacist, poor white trash of Asia. They're fucking sick of us because of sleazy pricks like Morrison and Dutton, Frydenberg, and in particular, Maurice Payne, the butch bitch who personally got up China's nose over COVID. She's the one who caused all of the trade sanctions that were imposed last year with her pro-Trumpian, white supremacist, yellow peril theories. And by the way, whereas we know we've blown $90 billion that we've already got committed to France, and as recently as last year, the Australian defence bureaucracy was stating that we couldn't possibly afford to cancel a deal with France on the submarines because at that point in time, we were so heavily committed contractually that it would cost us as much to back out of the deal as it would to go ahead. So that $90 billion is blown. It's just fucking gone. There's a completely blank check as far as the 8 Nukeyoulater-powered submarines that we're going to buy from Adelaide after they get built there, after the Americans teach Australia how to build a Nukeyoulater-powered submarine. Heard a bloke say yesterday that Australia spends 2% of its GDP on defence, and he thinks that it's quite reasonable to envisage pushing that up to 3 or 4 or perhaps 5% in order to field a sufficient military posture as to convince China that it's not worth attacking Australia. China never had any fucking intention of attacking Australia when we were prepared to trade in a civil fashion. When we started getting pretentious, bad-mannered, potty-mouthing, blaming China for the China virus because Donald Trump thought he could win votes among his counterfactual science denialists who vote for him. China applied trade sanctions to us on technicalities, the way nations do to each other. And instead of doing anything remotely sensible, we just got more bellicose, complained about everything that China did to sort of communicate to us that they had the shits with what our Minister for Foreign Affairs had said. So now, yeah, we're doing what Hungary did. We're backing the loudmouth, sword-waggling loser. Because what's America going to be doing in 18 years' time? Who's going to be running America in 18 years' time? Will there be a United States in 18 years' time? Today's the 17th. Tomorrow's the 18th. As far as I know, half of Trumpy's voters are expecting there to be a repeat of the insurrection of January 6th. I was assuming that America was going to use all its crackerjack counterinsurgency troops returning unemployed with their arse in a sling, sniffling and crying and whining and boo-hooing and bellowing and carrying on about how unfair it was that, you know, they got beaten, just like, you know, their fathers and grandfathers got beaten in Vietnam. I thought that all those counterinsurgency troops could be used to mop up the fucking lunatics from QAnon. But oh, no. We're going to bring them all over to Australia and have them running around doing hut exercises all over the Australian outback. That's the theory. Yet, the IPCC report says that we have to reduce to zero carbon emissions by 2050. Got to reduce by 50% by 2030, which is 8 years and 3 months away. How is this going to be achieved? One asks oneself. Well, a thermonucleator mushroom cloud decoration competition would probably do the job, you know, like if America and England try to see how many mushroom clouds they can install in the Chinese sky, and China sees how many mushroom clouds they can install in the Australian sky. This could be my best chance to have fucking plutonium on the cornflakes since 1963, when Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, and duly appointed minions conducted a plutonium fissile yield test at Maralinga to determine what would happen if one atom bomb went off milliseconds before another atom bomb on a different warhead was going to go off. Would the first atom bomb to go off, would its EMP derange the firing circuits on the second one? And what would happen if the explosives fired slightly out of sync? So they took a live plutonium core fission warhead, stuck it on a tower at Maralinga, and they fizzle yield detonated it and blew fucking plutonium dust into the atmosphere, upwind of me. Not much of it would have got here, but some of it did. It goes fucking everywhere, that shit. I can remember 1971, 50 years ago, carrying a newspaper with a headline that said Nixon was ready to drop N-bombs in Nam. Might have been 49 years ago. He was actually going to drop the bombs in Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What he did was he bombed Hanoi for Christmas instead. Gee, yeah, it'd be 72. I remember my parents going to civil defence lectures down at the town hall and coming home with pamphlets and basically a fairly solid assurance that there's nothing within a couple of 100 miles of Glen Innes that's actually militarily valuable to the point of targeting with an atomic warhead. They said it's possible that, you know, there might be an American boat in Brisbane or in Sydney. And perhaps the Chinese might launch a bomb onto that boat. And if they overshoot Brisbane or undershoot Sydney, then you could get an atom bomb on Glen Innes. But other than a mistake like that, the only thing you really have to worry about around here is a fallout plume from wherever your nearest likely target is. And here that is pine crap. A whole bunch of geodesic domes out in the desert to the west of Alice Springs, which was set up there so that the CIA could talk to the satellites looking down on Southeast Asia. And these days, I'm pretty sure it's a incredibly vital information data processing satellite upload download link in the American system that oversights everywhere from fucking Cape Town to Vladivostok across Australia, that whole section of the globe. And it has been widely understood for 40, 50 years by anybody who pays the slightest little bit of attention that anytime anybody decides to swap nuclear missiles with America, one of their first targets that they absolutely positively have to hit is Pine Gap. And it has no anti-missile defences unless they're space-based and we don't know about them. So whoever it is that wants to fight with America, whether it's fucking India or Pakistan or China or Russia, Pine Gap's going to cop a nuke. Probably Northwest Cape as well. You might as well say with a fair amount of certainty that Darwin as well, for Tyndall Air Force Base. Townsville, Broome, Brisbane, Jervis Bay, Sydney. These are places that you would expect anybody who wants to make it impossible for America to use Australia as a rear area reinforcement location as they did in the Second World War. Those are places that they would be more territorial denial, whereas Pine Gap, that's a counter-force attack. You take out Pine Gap and America goes blind over this whole hemisphere of the world. So yeah, it could be interesting. I think I could probably cope with a fallout plume from bloody Pine Gap. It's a long way away. Most of it will go either straight overhead or it'll fall out before it gets here. And I'm 60, you know, like how afraid of radiation-induced secondary cancers can you be when you're 60 years old and you had plutonium on the cornflakes in 1963? Yeah, so we spend 2% of Australia's GDP. They want to bump that up to 3 or 4 or 5%. The way to get your head around that is look at your own annual income. As a disability pensioner funded by, you know, iron ore sales to China, because that's what Australian economy runs on at the moment. As a disability pensioner, I get like $950 a fortnight, which is like $22,500 a year. So 1% is, you know, $224. 2% is twice that. $450, $494, something like that. I actually worked it out with a calculator, 26 times divided by blah, blah, blah. It works out to be just under $500 a year. Do I spend $500 a year on self-defense? Do I spend $500 a year on death machines and practicing with them so that I can assure myself that if somebody or something comes into my line of sight and I think I want to be frightened of them, that I am able to put my hand on a death machine and kill them dead or win a fucking medal before they get to me and do anything that can hurt me? Do I spend $500 a year on that psychopathic paranoid fantasy? I do not. Are there items within my possession which, if I were to have a psychopathic paranoid fantastic attack, I could put my hand on and go out and cause harm to other living animals, to other people? Yeah, I got a one-handed belt knife, a lock knife, and it's pretty bloody sharp too. And I can operate it one-handed. take it out and put it away. If I want to have a paranoid attack of the fantasies, I can do that. Did I buy it for chopping up marauding fucking kangaroos? No, I bought it for cutting string, for peeling apples. I bought it for cleaning my fingernails. It is a utility knife. Can it be used in a paranoid fantasy to attack somebody else? Yeah, it could. Is it going to be any use if a kangaroo approaches me, looks like it's being friendly, comes up to within reach out and give you a piece of bread range, and it suddenly jumps on me and wants to kick me intestines out across the other side of the fence? I don't believe the bloody knife would be much good to me. It is not a defensive weapon. It is a tool. Have I got an axe? Yeah, there's axes over there. Have I got a reaping hook? You know, can I run around looking like a Russian revolutionary? Yeah, I got one of them too. Are any of those things defensive weapons purchased for reasons of personal security? Not fucking one of them. I've got some bows and arrows in case I feel like trying conclusions with a feral pig. And I've done that once. Put an arrow straight through a pig. And then I realised that I only had a couple of more arrows than a Bowie knife, and everybody else who plays this game either has dogs or they have guns, and they have mates to help them. And how many pigs are in that blady grass, waist high, making noises? Happily, they were all running away. Do I spend 2% of my income on self-defence? No, I bloody don't. Why not? Well, I'm not what you call a practicing Christian, but I do have a passing knowledge of Christian doctrine, and I am aware that if you do a word search on everything that a fella called Jesus is supposed to have said a couple of thousand years ago, the one phrase that comes up at the top of the list, the thing he said most often, is have no fear, fear not, there is nothing to fear. He also said that you have to get back to the teachings of Moses and Deuteronomy, who both of them said, thou shalt not kill. I think it was Deuteronomy who said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Jesus plagiarized the Egyptian Book of the Dead and said, judge not thy fellow human, lest thine own heart, bracket, soul, be weighed in the balance against the feather of truth and found to be wanting. So I find it really ironic and pathetic that the people who claim to be God-fearing, upstanding Christians have declared that because of their fear of the slanty-eyed, yellow peril heathen Chinee, therefore they want to spend more than 2% of Australia's gross domestic product on weapons, on paranoid, murderous fantasies. They want to spend 3% or 4% or 5%. They want me to spend the equivalent of every Australian on my level, $1,250 a year on death machines, on shit that is only good for killing other humans. And they think that's rational. Because Gott mit uns, Gott mit uns, you know, like the German Kaiser had cast into the belt buckles of every one of his soldiers and sailors and airmen in the First World War. Gott mit uns. God's on my side. And because Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton and Maurice Payne and Friedenberg, because they believe that God's on their side, therefore they believe that they are justified in whatever they do here on earth, because it will be signed off on in heaven, because Gott mit uns. And the fact that Europeans and their colonial diaspora have treated the Chinese like shit consistently for 300 or 400 years, that means that China is supposed to just sit down and shut up and accept low wages and become the world's manufacturer of cheap, mass-produced goods. America's allowed to have 600 boats in its navy and patrol the world's oceans. But China's not. America is allowed to go anywhere in the world and kidnap anybody who they have reason to believe may have harmed or killed any American citizen, and spirit them back to America and try them and execute them. Like they did the fellas who hijacked the Nukeyoulater and threw a fat American-Israeli dual citizen over the back end of the boat when Ronald Reagan was President of America. He's the one who changed that law. The Americans complain about communist propaganda. Ronald Reagan was the one who got rid of the fairness doctrine, which used to make it illegal to tell lies in the news and editorial comment, broadcast or transported across any state boundaries in the USA. The Yanks complain, oh, Comrade Colonel Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin of the KGB has captured the Russian oligarchy. The KGB's captured the Kremlin. Oh, it's wicked, it's fucking evil, isn't it nasty and totalitarian, boo-hoo, sob-sob. George Herbert Walker Bush was shot down twice in the World War of the Two. He was the youngest American pilot to be shot down by the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. After that, he got into the CIA. He was the deputy director of the CIA during Ronald Reagan's first term. Ronald Reagan had dementia, Alzheimer's disease, fifth syndrome, fucked in the head syndrome. G.H.W. Bush moved from being the deputy director of the CIA to Ronald Reagan's vice president during the second term. There were two people who were in charge of the White House, the Oval Office, and American domestic and foreign policy during Reagan's second term. One of them was his vice president from the CIA, pulling those puppet strings. The other one was Nancy Reagan's special psychic friend, the astrologer. I had a learned commentator on the ABC radio the other day suggest that Air Force One couldn't take off unless Ronald cleared it with Nancy, cleared it with the astrologer, the psychic, who said, yeah, that's a propitious day for you to go flying. Reagan had no fucking idea what he was doing. The CIA had already captured the White House while Reagan was busy dementing. And then G.H.W. Bush becomes the prissy dunce of all America. He became the prissy dunce after the Soviet Union imploded. The Soviet Union imploded because Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle sold Reagan on the fantastic bullshit proposition that they could build a strategic defense initiative with hydrogen bomb satellites which would power X-ray lasers which would cook the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles during launch phase. And Reagan threw money at that project. And the Russians saw the money that was being thrown at it and they said, oh, fuck, we better try and super saturate their defences with so many ICBMs that they haven't got enough hydrogen bombs in orbit to cook them all with the X-ray lasers that Edward Teller, inventor of the hydrogen bomb, signed off on. Oh yeah, we can do this, Ronnie, this is a great idea. Yeah, you're very senile, aren't you, Ron? The USSR went broke trying to outbuild Reagan's Star Wars defence fantasy cooked up by a pair of science fiction writers. As soon as the USSR collapsed, the whole world thought, oh, marvellous, we can have a peace dividend. We don't have to spend all that money on military paranoia. We can build a world that's, actually good fun to live in for the workers. George H.W. Bush sent Madeleine Albright to Iraq to tell Sad Man Who's Insane, the American ally during the Iraqi-Iranian war. Yeah, mate, of course, we don't take any interest in minor internecine border disputes with our Arab client states. 2 weeks later, Iraq goes into Kuwait. George H.W. Bush says to the world, oh, the humanity, the humanity. It's just like Belgium in 1914. They're raping babies and throwing nuns in the air and catching them on their bayonets. So all of NATO went and fired off their entire anti-Soviet arsenal, a live fire exercise. Shot themselves Winchester, pop, 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 in the Saudi Arabian sand dunes. And as a part of that, the CIA got to undo Richard Nixon's OPEC prostitution, where he pimped the Pentagon, agreed to be paid in oil and dollars to provide for the military security of every oil field in OPEC. But there were no American troops in Saudi Arabia. G.H.W. Bush fixed that. He put the American troops into Saudi Arabia to guard it against the Iraqis. The Iraqis were never going to Saudi Arabia. Those troops stayed there for 10 years until after Osama bin Laden kept demanding that the troops be moved out of Saudi Arabia. George Bush the Jr., George Walker Bush, he decided, oh, well, we'll move those troops out of Saudi Arabia for you, Osama. What we'll do is we'll put them into Iraq and they can occupy Iraq. They can go looking for weapons of mass destruction, the ones that don't fucking exist. It'll mean that we can shoot off all of the rebuilt stockpile that Daddy had to order after going into Iraq the first time. Only this time we're not coming out. We're going to stay there because Afghanistan's boring. And as Rumsfeld said, there are no good targets in Afghanistan. We need to go to Iraq. There are things we can bomb in Iraq. So what do you think might be the motivation behind the pentagonal hemorrhoids who've conspired together with Morrison and Johnson to decide that we need a huge military build-up in the Southwest Pacific? It's because they haven't got the fucking Afghanistan forever war anymore. They haven't got a source of endless military refurbishment and resupply contracts. They haven't got an excuse to keep throwing taxpayers' money at new BangBangs. What I don't believe the Pentagon has paid particular attention to is that the American Treasury is financed by Peking's savings banks. 75% of the US Treasury's foreign debt is held by Peking's savings banks. If Peking's banks decide to stop buying US Treasury bonds, America goes fucking bankrupt no matter what they gather together in Congress to say they agree to do about the deficit. Peking financed the occupation of Afghanistan by buying American Treasury bonds to keep the American economy afloat. So now we're going to get nuclear underwater boats to be paid for on the never never by the Australian government, who says that they're broke because of COVID. Not that we've beaten COVID, rather we've decided we're going to open up our states as soon as we've got 70% of the eligible population double vaccinated, which equates to 56% of the total population vaccinated. Our politicians are behaving as if being vaccinated stops transmission, and it doesn't. It does not. If you're a vaccinated person, double vaccinated, you can still collect and become infected by 40% of every virus you meet. Meet 10, 4 of them are going to become established within your respiratory tract. And once a vaccinated person is infected, 40% of them are going to be completely asymptomatic, and everybody else is only going to be mildly sick, so they might not get tested. So they behave like an asymptomatic carrier. And the double vaccinated are just as contagious. They make as much virus and they shed as much virus as an unvaccinated person. So opening the economy once you become this, that, or the other percentage vaccinated doesn't friggin' work. Issuing vaccine passports on people's mobile phones doesn't work because a big bunch of people don't have a mobile phone of sufficient sophistication to accept such a thing, and a lot of people lose their mobile phones every bloody day of the week. The people in the restaurants and the pubs and the clubs and the concerts and all, they hate the idea of it, but the only thing which successfully suppresses transmission, it's not vaccination, it's getting a good mask and wearing it properly. It's minimising travelling and gathering, getting people to stay in their local area. No, you can't have a fucking holiday and drive 500 miles for the weekend. Coincidentally, that will stop carbon emissions as well. So by responding to COVID, we effectively act behaviourally to at least burn less carbon. By indulging ourselves in a military build-up in order to attempt to contain China, we take our minds off COVID, we take our minds off global warming, we pretend that the great big threat Australia faces is militant, yellow, perilous Chinamen. How dare they want to control what happens in the South China Sea? Don't they know that America likes to control everything right up to the bloody 12-mile shoreline of every country which boundaries the Pacific and the Atlantic? Like I said, the only pleasant vibe I get out of all of this is that, as it was foretold within the prophecy, I told you this shit was going to go down. I've been saying it on YouTube for 10 years. 20 years ago, when we went into bloody Afghanistan, I wrote letters to the editor saying that it was an absolutely stupid and futile exercise to go to the graveyard of empires and attempt to occupy the place. I asked how many Australians were going to get killed there. 42. Thank you, Douglas Adams, 42. I asked how many Australians were going to come home head fucked from PTSD, waking up, 6 inches above the bed, screaming. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I think 5,500 went over there. Some of them went there 6 or 9 times. You'd have to say we'd have to have 3,000 or 4,000 cases of PTSD that we have manufactured for ourselves by attempting to occupy the graveyard of empires for 20 years, because that's what we thought America wanted us to do. And we are the 51st state. We are America's version of what Hungary was to Der Third Reich. And it gives me the shits. We weren't really headed this direction until Johnny Howard opened the gates to the South African refugees from Nelson Mandela. The business migration scheme that encouraged anybody anywhere in the world who had more than $1 million in a bank account that they could show as proof to come to Australia, because this is the last place in the world where a rich white person can treat blackfellas like shit. Can't do it in America. The white South Africans didn't want to go there. Can't do it in Asia. It's full of coloured people. Can't do it anywhere else in Africa. Can't do it in Europe. So they come here. Damn, I wish New Zealand would fucking invade Australia and take the place over and put us under Jacinda Ardern's governorship. It's about the only way we can get out of this fucking mess that we've got ourselves into now. But of course, the Kiwis are not stupid enough to want to become responsible for the West Island of New Zealand. They don't want 25 million fucking Australians who can't feed themselves unless they've got 3 boatloads of refined transport fuel arriving on the shores per day. Why would that be? One wonders. So anyway, them's my thoughts on Peter Dutton's sudden snap decision without any discussion or debate or vote to commit Australia to nuclearising its navy with great big long cylindrical blunt-ended tubes full of seamen lurking under the waves. People say you can't judge a book by its cover. I'm not as silly as I look. I look about as silly as the fucking surrounding Australians really are, and because I therefore appear harmless, thus and because they don't shoot me in my headlights. Peter Dutton looks like a fucking prick, and he is. He looks like a fucking prick, and he is a fucking prick. And he really has doomed Australia to getting their ass kicked by the Chinamen any which fucking way they feel like it. As it were foretold within the prophecy. Sit back, pass the popcorn and watch. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.